All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. We have the latest edition of the Grim Wisdom podcast. The idea, as always, is we're going to provide you with some uncomfortable truths, and you're going to wish you hadn't heard them. With me today is Jennifer Siciliano, first returning guest of the podcast.
Yes.
Hopefully, I have at least some better idea of what I'm doing now. My apologies to anybody who was expecting me to do a podcast last week. I just got swamped with some real life stuff involving cars and not having one, which I'm sure as anybody else who's listening with a car can attest. It's kind of an urgent issue when you can't get from point A to point B anymore suddenly. So how to address that, but we're back on the air today, although I don't know air is the right word, and we're going to be talking to Jennifer about a couple of different things. So I thought we'd start off by talking about your candidacy.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know, Jennifer ran for state rep down in Warwick Neck.
Oakland Beach, too.
Oakland Beach, too. I'm sorry, you live in Warwick Neck, right?
Yes.
But she ran for state rep down here in Warwick.
District 22.
District 22, thank you. A couple of years ago, and although she was defeated, she got a very large percentage of the vote. It was it was like 39 point
39
something.
point something, rounded up to 40.
40. Just tell everybody 40, right?
Yes.
And so this year, I think she's got a real shot to win. She's definitely more committed this time. She's more energized. But I thought you could tell us a little bit about why you think you have a better shot to win, because definitely your opponent has the benefits of incumbency and all of the corrupt rewards that flow from that. So I thought you could talk to us a little bit about your candidacy and why you're running.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's actually kind of negative that he's incumbent, because I think a lot of people are looking for change. And I wanted to get back into running for state rep, and I was unsure whether I wanted to run this coming election or not. And but then Bernie Sanders won Rhode Island, and the next day I thought to myself, you know, Rhode Islanders really want progressive Democrats. They do not want, I'm sure some people want Hillary, but I think that most of the Democratic establishment in Rhode Island are very much Hillary supporters, and it's just one symptom of them not listening to their constituents who loudly said they wanted Bernie. And I'm a progressive, so I'm not just running because I think that my ideas are good, but that I think that Rhode Islanders want more a progressive agenda as well.
So that's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But before we get more into the broader political implications, tell us a little bit more about your specific race. Like, tell us about who your opponent is and why you think he can be beat and should be beat.
Well, it's Joe Solomon Jr. that I'm running against, and I don't like to say negative things about people, so I'm not gonna.
You're not going to say anything at all.
No, I think that he is a good guy, and I think that he did minimal things in the General Assembly. One of the laws he proposed was getting license plates for Rocky Point, giving people the ability to buy those, and also
well, at the risk of
yes.
being rude, I want to interrupt you before you say too many more nice things about the guy. So I know you're running for office, so it would be impolitic of you to agree with me with what I'm about to say, but I think that whenever you're saying his name, you should always emphasize the junior, because he really is a junior. He's got a daddy with the same name. As near as I can tell, I've met him on a couple of occasions. He's not dim. He's not bright. He's not mean. He's not kind. I mean, he just impresses me as a complete tool. A guy who's never once in his life been required to do anything that caused him to take a risk. He's a lawyer who inherited his daddy's money, so he got a law degree and he inherited his daddy's law practice. His daddy got him to be state rep, and I guess his daddy wants to be a judge, so that was part of the plan. And I just don't know that the guy stands for anything or has any value. I think that in Rhode Island, in particularly, and ties into what I wanted to mention earlier about you were talking about Bernie. I do think one of the pitfalls of reading of coming to that conclusion that Rhode Islanders really want progressive change is it's at least a viable hypothesis that Rhode Islanders want anti-establishment.
Yes.
Trump did particularly well here as well.
True.
And I think that Joe Solomon is the epitome of the establishment. He doesn't even have his own name, right? That's how
he is a political part of a political
he is a
legacy.
political legacy. He's from a well-connected family. They have their tentacles into a lot of places in the state.
Many places.
Right. I mean, and most of them are lawyers or judges or other degenerate occupations.
The funny thing that happened last time I ran, when I knocked on doors, I would tell people who I was running against, and they said, "Oh, it's that guy. I saw his commercials." And I was like, "No, that's Michael Solomon. He's running for mayor of Providence, but that's his cousin." So
Yeah. Yeah.
like, you know.
So it's interesting that we say we don't want, we say we want democracy, and yet we're always happy to elect the people that we're told to, even if they're members of a politically connected family whose wealth and power comes from multi-generational, I should say, political dominance. The Kennedys. I never understood why anyone would vote for Patrick Kennedy. There was literally nothing to him at all that was positive, and there still isn't. Since getting out of office, he's been an embarrassment and a hindrance.
I think
and
that
but despite the Kennedys' many failings as human beings and politicians, we continue to elect them just because we were told to, and they're a family that's well connected politically.
Well, the thing is about
on a smaller scale, we have the Solomons. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Solomon, I think not only do I feel it, but many people see it, that he grew up, like you said, to be in politics. He was raised to be in politics. He wants to be a politician, and it's not about trying to help his district. It's not about trying to change and shake up the apple tree. I think that I want to go up there and shake it up and bring the Democrats, at least the Democratic Party, wants a more progressive agenda, I believe. And I'm going to really try to be part of the movement to change that.
So tell me a little bit more about the nature of your district. I mean, what do you think are the issues that are most important to the members of your district? I mean, besides, we could talk about the general political climate in Rhode Island, how there's a great deal of institutional corruption. Jennifer is kind of shrugging at me right now. I think she doesn't have prepared remarks on this subject. But I think it'll be interesting over the next few months to see what their biggest concerns are. One of the things that bothers me the most is that I remember the last time I interviewed you, I think by then we already had, but if not then shortly after, there was...
The Gallison...
Oh, no, not the Gallison scandal. No, he sent out... like a newsletter, patting himself on the back because he had won an award from some animal rights group.
This is Joe Solomon,
Yeah, Joe Solomon Jr. So Jr., we're just going to call him Jr. I don't think we should give him the name because I don't think he deserves to be given a name, because a name is for people that have their own identity. And he was assigned an identity in birth and simply accepted it. So we should just call him Jr. because he's the embodiment of his father's malign plans for him. But
okay.
Anyway, our boy Junior, he put forth a bill on some animal rights thing.
Yeah, that people take care of their animals or they'll get fined. If it's
right.
Outdoors, they need to have shelter and water, and that's a wonderful kind of law. But
the thing is, it's like moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic while it's sinking, right? I mean, that's not the issue that's of primary concern to Rhode Islanders.
That's how I felt when I felt that he did that law to, like a regular politician, trying to show that, oh, he's a good guy, look what he does, and everyone can pat him on the back and say that's a great thing. But Is that the priority? How about increasing minimum wage? I mean,
Well, and
more
this
beneficial tax.
he was touting this because he had dropped this bill in the hopper. I don't think he dropped many bills at all. Although in his defense,
Yeah.
nobody drops bills. You got Nick Mattiello needs to give you approval to drop a bill, really. But this was his big
Well,
legislative achievement, and it didn't even come to a vote.
It
Right, it was killed in
pass.
committee, right?
Right.
So like
Well, no,
everything.
I don't know if it. Well,
I'll bet you it was held for further study because that's pretty much how they
Possibly,
do
yeah.
everything on the
Yes.
state house. But the point is, it didn't pass. It didn't become law. So that's his signature legislative achievement. Is everybody's worried about the economy? Rhode Island is still slowly struggling to come out of the Great Recession. We're finally starting to get some traction, but that's his signature achievement over his.
that didn't
his
even
period
get
in office
passed.
is
Now, he did get an award from some animal rights organization for proposing that law, but
We should look into that because I'll bet you he gave him a bribe through the legislative grants program in order to get that award.
wow.
I'll bet you he did. I mean,
Could be.
that's extremely
I
common.
don't think so, but
Because it's not considered a conflict of interest. I mean, a dirtbag lawyer like Junior wouldn't consider it to be unethical to bribe an organization.
I
and
feel
accept
uncomfortable ragging
Speculating.
on him so much.
that. I understand. Well, you don't have to. I'm ragging on him.
because he is
I am
decent
particularly outraged as the 5 regular listeners to my podcast will know. I'm particularly outraged by legacy politicians. I think that the bar should be much higher if your daddy was a politician, if your family is well connected. The bar in terms of expectations should be much higher, not much lower, right? I mean, I think most voters, if you talk to them, they'd agree that all things being equal, they'd rather vote for somebody who is a little bit different, who looks more like them and is more likely to represent their interests. But we just don't get much of that,
No.
And I think your opponent, Junior, is a pretty much a paradigm example of a legacy politician. He's as white as the day is long. He's a lawyer. He comes from a wealthy family. He doesn't even really live in your district. His
Yes.
family own multiple houses.
Yes.
He just says that he lives at the house that,
yes.
Yeah.
But
Which must be nice. It must be nice to have
be
so
able
many
to-
houses you can just find a district to run in that happens to be vulnerable,
Or, yeah,
and pretend that you live there, right?
right.
I guess Lincoln Chafee did the same thing though. It's a
did
very
he?
well. Remember when Lincoln Chafee? For those of you who don't know, Lincoln Chafee, another complete no account legacy politician who people remember fondly because he was better than Raimondo, but he had his residence in Providence for some purposes, and of course he spent all of his time at his more valuable houses. But he had a residence way out in the western part of the state, in one of those small communities where all of his cars lived, so that he could get around the car tax. And of course,
Oh.
he signed off on a budget that forced the cities and towns to all raise their car tax.
Right.
But he managed, because his family has multiple residences, he said, "Oh, all my cars just happen to live in the town that has the lowest car tax," which is despicable, I mean,
Right.
but that's just, the problem isn't so much rich people taking advantage of loopholes like that, right? I mean,
Yes.
you're always going to have people looking for loopholes at all ends of the economic spectrum, and you're always going to have people with influence who are in a better position to capitalize on those loopholes. The problem is when those same people write those loopholes into the law and then take advantage of them deliberately.
That's pretty bad, yes.
It's pretty, and essentially by voting for a budget that forces cities and towns to raise their taxes and then moving your cars, that's what you're
The
doing.
real thing is that the taxes on the cars is very much a regressive tax. And, it just bothers me about how Mattiello is trying to make the range of the estate tax higher, so that really, really, really rich people will not leave the state. Now, if you were really, really, really rich, would it really matter where you lived? Like, you could afford to pay some taxes. That's what I don't get.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt
No.
you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think I think in just tying back into what we're talking about, the really rich don't live in one place anyway. They live in whatever place has the
So
lowest
that's what
taxes.
made me, yeah.
You know, I mean, if you own property in Aspen and in Florida and in Aruba and also in Rhode Island, you're not going to sell your property in Rhode Island just because the estate tax is higher. When you die, you're going to die under the laws of Aruba or wherever it is. You know.
Yes.
I mean, we're increasingly seeing at the very high end of the spectrum, we're even seeing ultra rich people surrender their American citizenship,
Yes.
renounce their American
I've
citizenship to
read that
become
as
citizens
well.
of like the Cayman Islands or wherever, so they can get around U.S.
These
taxes.
things make me really angry because this is a very, in my estimation, a more Republican idea that there's trickle down economics, that these people are job creators, which I don't believe that they are. And at the same time, the state makes disabled people and seniors pay for buses to get around, to go to the doctor. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
You know what's ridiculous is, I think, a very kind word for some of these activities. The David Norton on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, he pointed out an example of the most despicable behavior I can even imagine from a politician. Because what they were doing. By the way,
Joe Solomon voted for that.
You mean Junior?
Junior.
Junior voted for that. Yes.
Junior voted for putting them.
You can say Junior. I mean, that is his name is Junior. Don't say Joe Solomon, because I'm like, what? You mean the guy on the city council who wants to be a judge, right? Or do you mean Junior, right? And you want to disambiguate, right? So just say Junior.
Junior voted for the increase in the fares for the disabled and seniors. Of course he did. Of course he did, because he went along with the establishment.
Right. He was told to, and he did. But I wanted to tell you about this because I think you and I have talked about this before, but David Norton, he pointed out the most despicable behavior I can even imagine, where David Norton has been having difficulty when he's knocking on doors trying to meet people in his district. There's a few senior facilities, nursing homes that won't let him in, where he's getting a lot of trouble from the administrators. And what's happened is the state over the last few years has cut hundreds of millions from the Medicaid budget. So, and of course Medicaid, a large amount of Medicaid benefits go directly to poor seniors, right, paying for nursing home benefits. So there have been large cuts at the state level in the state budget, which of course Junior voted for. I mean, not that they didn't all vote for it, but
they all voted for it.
They should all be gone.
That's absolutely ridiculous.
Right, I mean, they should all be gone for voting for it, but Junior voted for it. But the thing that's most despicable is, at the same time as they were cutting these the Medicaid budgets, they were giving comparatively small grants to the nursing homes, right?
Legislative grants, yes.
Right. So I'm going to take away the core funding of your organization so that you're desperate, and then in your desperation, I'm going to throw you a tiny lifeline, which isn't vaguely sufficient to replace the funding that I've taken from you. And in exchange for that lifeline, I'm going to demand that you publicly express your gratitude, you say only good things about me, that you don't let my political opponents into your facility.
Which is happening, yes.
Which is, I think that's the most dishonest and despicable thing I have ever heard, right? It's just, I'm taking your money away simply to make you desperate so I can give you some of it back to make you my property, make you my bitch, basically, if you'll forgive my use of the word.
Well, yeah, I mean, these stories and these things that I've seen are what propel me forward to running, because somebody needs to watch out to connect all these dots. Legislators are really doing these things. I mean, a lot of times, like we talked about how Junior would say, I did this great law or about for animals, and that makes people feel really good. But what's the important part? The important part is that he does take legislative grants, that we still have legislative grants, and it gives incumbents a leg up. Yes, it makes these organizations obligated to the candidate, and gets maybe their board members to vote for the candidate, or gets the people that are helped by the organization, the nonprofit, to be encouraged to vote for that candidate, all because they gave some money to them.
Right. Even if they cut their budget indirectly by voting for the state budget that destroyed their organization.
I know.
Right.
And these things have to be watched. These legislators, they're always, I'm telling you, they are shifting things around, and you really have to know what's going on. And
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No,
Please
no.
continue.
No, it's okay.
Well, I think people that listen to the podcast, I mean, presumably they're not tired of listening to me, but
Yeah.
you're the draw. You're the star.
I'm the draw, I'm the
Yeah.
star.
Yeah.
I should have drank some caffeine before I
Well,
came
you'll just
on.
have to do your best.
I will.
So,
So what do you want to talk about other than that? I mean, I think that all these things are important to the reason why I'm running for office. I'm a progressive. I think the politicians need to be watched. I think they're, I don't want to be part of the establishment. I think it needs to get kicked out. I mean, those are all the essential things.
all right. Well, thank you.
And I'm a cool person.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a tough one though, because if you have a lot of money to seem cool, it's not that hard to seem cool. It's funny how I was reading an article. It was an editorial written by Nick Mattiello not too long ago, and in it
Yeah.
he opens up by talking about enjoying a beautiful ride on his motorcycle. And I can't help but think of him at the White House fundraiser last year, where actually I think you went there as well.
Yeah.
At Sheldon White House's fundraiser, and I saw this guy getting off of his motorcycle and swaggering over to this with this big smirk on his face to pick on Sam Bell. And I never more wanted to spit in a man's face in my entire life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I just wanted to wipe that 1,000-watt
Well,
smoke
that's
off
the
his
thing,
face.
you know, I see it-
He was such a smug, worthless
Yeah.
SOB, but he spins
Well-
that as, I'm a free spirit because I ride a motorcycle because I enjoy nature.
Yeah.
No, you're a motorcyclist because you enjoy, I don't know, driving loud through quiet neighborhoods.
Like, look at me. I'm like a regular guy.
exactly.
I like motorcycles. I'm a
Yeah.
man's man.
Yeah, yeah.
But, that's one of the things about being a politician. You're often, you have to wear suits, or women have to wear their little suits and their pearls and things like that. And I think that, it's not being honest to who they are. And I think people see that, and that's one of the reasons why people hate politicians, is because they're being fake, they're being not genuine.
Right.
And I try to be as genuine as I can. I mean, I think now I kind of dress up when I go out a little bit, just because
Well, I think that's
people are going to see
also
me.
that's like a combination of a symptom and a cause, because we have so many lawyers in politics, and lawyers, as I've said before, I don't necessarily ask everybody to share my prejudice against the legal profession, although I do think that the law is just an implement that's used to oppress people and take away their freedom and power. But I don't necessarily expect you all to go that far with me. I do think, though, that it's fair to say that lawyers spend a good amount of their career being deliberately disingenuous. You arrange your outfit in this
I've
way
got
to
this
suit
idea.
the ego of the judge. Oh, okay. What do you want to say?
Yeah. Well, I was just, all these lawyers are in the State House, and one of the problems is that there's very few people who can work part-time as a legislator, that can take time off to do it. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to be a difficult thing. And the only way we can change that is by a constitutional convention, I believe. But everybody is frightened, including myself, for a constitution convention because of money in politics. That's the concern.
It doesn't seem to me that we need a constitutional convention. We can simply amend the Constitution.
To make it so, yeah, that's true.
Right. I mean, imagine
I
we
think
could
we
put
should
together.
have a full-time. I think we have a full-time legislature.
Right. I mean, I think if once we get if we get enough good people in there, we can get a referendum put on the ballot. Because one of the perverse things about Rhode Island's constitutional process is that the citizens have no ability to modify the Constitution directly. They only get to vote on constitutional issues when the legislature has deemed it worthy.
To
Right.
go on.
Right. And usually usually when the legislature wants to keep their fingerprints off something, or when they don't care enough about something
Yes.
to take any risks, they put it before the voters, right? So
Like regulating marijuana.
Right,
But,
so the
but
well,
they're not even going to do that.
they're not even
I
gonna
hear
do it.
that.
They're putting forth a non-binding resolution. It's simply another stall tactic. But the point is, I think you could have a series of constitutional amendments, one saying we have a full-time legislature, one saying we slim down the size of the legislature, because let's face it, we have
Yes.
we
I've
have a
heard that.
ridiculous number of state reps and senators all total for such a small state. I'm not saying that we need to have necessarily smaller districts, but
Or
what is
larger districts.
right? But what is the purpose of the multiple layers of duplication of government? You know, we have one common criticism you hear of Rhode Island's system of government is we have way more municipalities than a lot of other states with their own legal, with their own.
I know I've
organizations.
heard that a lot, but it's pretty much that way in all of New England. So I don't know why people are always complaining about that.
Well, I would be interesting to see.
I know
other
why
states.
people
I know
are
other
complaining
states
about that,
have
but-
a unicameral legislature, which I don't really. I understand the purpose of having a House and a Senate at the federal level,
Mm-hmm.
right? The primary one being the Senate is elected for 6 years, and the House is elected for 2
Right.
years.
Right, which is not
and-
the case in Rhode Island.
Right, in Rhode Island, they're
State.
all up every 2 years.
So
So-
how is what's? I
Yeah.
mean, there is differences, but
And by matter of convention, there are times when the Senate exercises its power, but by and large, most important decisions are made in the House in
it's
Rhode
true.
Island.
I
You know,
I
the
think if
budget
we had
comes through the
full-time
House.
legislators, I think there would be more competition for the job, and I think we'd get better qualified people. You know, well, I also think there needs to be a lot of more transparency. I just see things that get covered up all the time. People, I've told you before, agendas going up the last minute for the Commerce Corp at the very last point where they can still do the 48-hour open meetings law. And everything from that and not having all the Rhode Island general laws in one place that you can search. It's written in all these different web pages, and it's not easy to browse. They just make and even when Gina Raimondo came out with her budget, she had this big website about. I'm kind of going all over the place, but Gina Raimondo had this big website about her budget, and there were a lot of missing pieces in it. I mean, it was just show. It's just show. It's not the real information. And I think that, first of all, a legislator, if it was full time, you would have the time to read all the testimonies when there's a public hearing. I mean, I hear how they don't read anything. The people don't stay at the meeting. We heard in the Providence Journal that the organizations that got community grants went up to the committee, and only Eileen Naughton was the only one there. I mean, people on committees should be at their committee meetings.
Right, but
There shouldn't
in
be this,
particular,
we're so busy for everything. Well,
but it's not that they're busy. It's that, and I've commented on this before on the podcast too. It's that they're worthless cowards. If the meeting is something where they know turnout will be low, they all show up. If the meeting is something where they know turnout will be high, they don't bother, right?
Yes.
So with this legislative grants, with all this attention on the grants program, why would anybody want to go to that committee meeting and have to have their poor little fragile egos challenged by the peasants, right? By villagers with torches.
I think you're very true
And,
about the courage and
you know,
the bravery that they do not have.
that they do not have.
That
you know,
they,
when I went, I've been to the State House several times, and if I go and it's an issue where there's not a bunch of people outside, it's not that controversial of an issue, nobody shows up. Sometimes they'll show up if it's a bloodbath, right? Sometimes during the gun control hearings or other things where there's rabid supporters on both sides of an issue, the legislature will show up because they'll know that They'll want to look good, but they'll want to be able to play both sides, and so the fear that you're just going to get yelled at for hours straight is less. But I remember I've been up there about student loan bills or progressive taxation bills, where there's only really one side to the issue. Nobody bothers to show up in force to say. You never see this huge broad base of support for, hey, lower the taxes for the wealthiest 1%. You might see one guy show up from the chamber, right? But you're not going to see a mass number of people because they can't mobilize that many people to show up for that, And and obviously student loan bills, who's going to show up and say, no, students should pay more in interest? Nobody's going to show up for that. Right. So those are the times when they just don't bother to show up. They don't want to have to hear it. And I've heard from a legislator that this written testimony, it's kind of an nitty-gritty thing. I think it's worthwhile to talk about process sometimes, especially when the failures of the process are so vivid and so obvious, at the presidential level, which we're going to get to in a minute. But I think also, too, you run the risk of turning people off a little bit when you talk too much about process because in the great grand scheme of things, how much does process matter if it doesn't produce a different result, right? So, for example, and I'll just give you one example, and then I think we can move on unless you have more to say. I heard that, so when you show up, you can testify before a committee, or they can ignore you, or you can bring your testimony in written form. And legislators that are incumbents, people like Junior, will always insist that they love getting written testimony, they read it all, right? Legislators who don't know any better will privately admit to you, and I've heard this from several legislators, none of whom wanted to go on the record, that written testimony, not only is it never read, but it can't be read. It's not organized in any electronic form. It's literally, you bring your written testimony, and it goes in a 3-ring binder. There aren't even copies made. Right?
I think that they require you to make like 27 copies.
Yeah, they want you to bring. They want you to bring 20-some copies of your testimony, and if the secretary's feeling overburdened, they'll just put all 27 of those copies in one 3-ring binder and just a pile, right? And any legislator that wants can check out the 3-ring binder and hand flip through the many pages to find the testimony, right? But then how is that a good system? That's a good system for 1916, not 2016, right? So,
well, yeah, I think that's one of the, like you're saying, process is kind of boring to some people, but process to me is important because I think it does change outcomes.
I think that, but the reason I bring up this example is I don't actually think it matters whether written testimony is available in electronic form or in paper form, because legislators are not going to read it any no matter what. They're going to decide in a smoke-filled room, sitting over a conference table at somebody's law practice or another, or in a beautiful taxpayer-funded room at the State House, right? With no cameras and no microphones. They're going to make all the important decisions, right? They're going to decide strategically how to repackage those decisions into something as palatable as possible, and then they'll pretend to reach those decisions in public.
Well, that's the thing is also the culture.
Yes.
The culture
and that's
up
more
there
what concerns me, is the culture rather than the process. I think there's a valid point of when you have a process that is so clearly designed to shield legislators from popular accountability rather than to embrace it, then that process engenders a culture, but it supports a culture that is very opaque. But what we're having right now is we're having a tremendous amount of heat being put on the legislature, and they're going to be forced to change process, at least for some things, but they're not going to change the culture at all,
Well, wasn't that a joke with the Ethics Commission? The Galveston thing happened, and then Mattiello wants to propose new ethics legislation, but then he has this blackout period of the most important time that you would need it between signing up to be a candidate and the day after the election. Right. It's like, what? Are you kidding me? And then maybe, it's all for show. Oh my gosh.
And on average, the declaration is 6 months before the general. So that means that the blackout period is literally 1 month out of every 4.
But
because there's an election every 2 years, right?
But
Not counting
that's the
special
thing that I
elections.
can't stand is that they do things for show, and then they also
Well, I think
I kind of lost my train of thought. Yeah.
it's okay. You can take as much time as you want. They're not going to hear this. We're going to cut it out.
Okay. Well,
They do things for show.
And oh, okay. They do things for show, and then they also wait to act until something terrible happens. Like they don't put that ethics commission law through until the Gallison incident. I mean, they could have brought it up years ago. I believe it's been 7 or 8 years, and that's the kind of thing that that's what I want to look at.
You know, I think
I don't want to be reactionary. I want to be proactive. I do not want to be reactive to, this happened. I want to look through the law and make corrections, make things better, not, I better do something or otherwise people are going to say, I'm a bad legislator or something like that.
I think, though, that even being truly reactive would still be a giant step forward because the rule in Rhode Island for at least the 10 years that I've lived here has been over and over again, offer the people a piece of meat and continue business in the same way it's always been, right? So we saw Gordon Fox, who for many years was clearly committing ethical lapses and eventually went to prison.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And they just said, it's just him, right? Well, you voted for him for years. Everybody voted for him for years, right?
Right.
There was, which nobody talks about anymore, but there was a very blatant experience where the brother of the treasurer, David Caprio, is the brother. He used to be the chairman of the Rhode Island Democratic Party.
I know.
And he caught blatantly big bid rigging.
Yep.
The state contract for concession stands at the state beaches.
Yes.
Right? And it was so blatant, the bid rigging was, it was almost like they didn't even realize that it was unethical. Right?
Yeah, well, I think that happens too.
And I think, these people are supposed to be lawyers.
They don't have a moral compass.
They don't have a moral compass, but they're so used to, getting back to what you said earlier, the culture is so corrupt, it's so insider, there's so many juniors and brothers involved that they just truly don't understand what's wrong with doing business in this way.
Yes.
Right? It's like if you own a business, it's not morally wrong to hire your brother to work at your business. And if you own a state government, why is it morally wrong to control the output of that state government to enrich your family, right? And they think of themselves as our owners, right? To quote George Carlin.
Wow.
But so there was a bid rigging scandal, and like what happened after Gordon Fox? Well, they just fed us him as a piece of meat. What happened after this bid rigging scandal? Well, they just fed us this guy as a piece of meat. And it was funny because he had his brother had run for governor and said something so outrageous about Obama that it cost him the election. He probably would have won, but it was so outrageous. We voted for Chafee, even though none of us like Chafee, but we could tolerate him, and we couldn't tolerate what this guy's brother said about. But then he comes back and runs again, and it turns out, his daddy's a judge, and they're all lawyers, and they're all infesting government at one level or another. The whole family is connected.
Like you're saying, it's the culture. They think that this is the correct way to run politics.
Right.
Well, it isn't.
Right. And it's interesting because if you've ever had the experience of going into a courtroom, which if you ever had a traffic ticket, you have, and if you showed up for it. If you ever had the experience, I had this reminded earlier this week because I went into court to get a ticket dismissed. And first of all, they're always behind schedule. And I remember there was one lady that was in there, and she had apparently been before the courts before because she has some sort of mental problem where she can't clean up her house. And neighbors have complained about it. The city's had a problem with it. Won't clean up her property, and whatever, right? So the city ordered her to clean up her property. But this judge, he went on a 20-minute diatribe where he castigated from on high. We got to hear all of his self-righteousness. He talked about how there are TV shows about crazy people like you. Like, he literally said that.
Jeez.
He literally said that.
Like hoarders or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's American jurisprudence, you know? And
Well, that's another problem, is that the judges get appointed lifetime appointments instead of being elected, which is an option.
well, I don't know that being elected is necessarily better for judges. We could talk about that in detail. The problem I've always had with judges is every judge I've ever seen has been just so arrogant and so self-righteous, it's hard to even be in the same room
Yeah,
with
if
them.
you have a lifetime appointment, there is no motivation whatsoever to
Right.
have court on time, to be,
Yeah.
you have no,
And when he finally got to all the people that were there for traffic issues, first of all, I felt that he was much harder on the men than the women. Like, in a couple of cases, I felt like he was flirting with the woman. But be that as it may,
jeez.
you know, he would threaten people. Well, I'll cite you for contempt if you interrupt me again. But of course, he feels free to interrupt whoever, right? And that's
Well,
how.
he's the judge.
Well, he's the judge, right? And we always have to address him as Your Honor, even if we don't think he's honorable, right? But just the funny thing was, the thing that really got me was the blind hypocrisy at the end, where he said, "And I'm just so sorry. We've never been this late before," right? Which
Yeah.
I don't believe, because every time I've ever been to court,
Yeah.
ever, for a traffic ticket, they're always way behind. But he had just wasted 20 minutes of everybody's time. There's a courtroom full of people waiting to get their tickets heard, most of whom will just be dismissed. And he spent 20 minutes castigating this woman, talking about how superior he was to her, right? All he needed to do was render the decision and get her on out of there, right? He could have been respectful of our time, right? But he genuinely, I
Well, he
believe,
felt like he needed to do that. That's what he...
well, I believe in his head, there is no disconnect between wasting all of our time listening to him and courts being late. You know? How often does he even work? He probably only works a couple of nights a week, right? We pay him full time, but he only works 2 nights a week. I wonder about these judges. But anyway.
Well, you were going to talk about Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, maybe I'll cut some of the stuff
Yeah.
about judges. But, or maybe I won't. So we're going to talk about the national election. Moving on. Bernie Sanders tomorrow is set. I think he'll win California, and
That would be a big middle finger to Hillary.
it'll be a big middle finger, but, I mean, what does she care about middle fingers? I mean, I think that she's abandoned all dignity, along with all principle, and she's almost abandoned all pretense at this point. You know, I mean, it's sad when you can't even manage pretense.
Well, you know, the media has been saying that she is going to be the nominee, but you know, they all were wrong about Trump. They thought Trump was going to go away, and now he's the nominee. So, I mean, maybe these people don't know anything, really.
Well, that's the thing that's funny to me, is that, and we've talked before, I know that you have privately sort of mocked me for how much I bag on David Brooks, but he's just a good example of, I mean, I've mentioned how much I despise this guy like 3 times on the podcast. Probably you're all this sick of hearing it, but, you know, guess what? You got to hear it again. It's worth repeating, damn it.
Someone at a graduation that I went to quoted David Brooks.
Wow. Well, that sounds like an interesting story.
Yeah, just last week, but...
But the interesting thing is, there's all of these people in financial services, particularly bad, but in the media in general, especially in this election spectacle, where first of all, they don't ever report on the issues, they only report on the horse race. The media loves the horse race.
They do.
And so the election gets longer every year, and they just love that because it means a longer horse race. It means more to report on. And then the Republican primary, of course, got way more media coverage because there was such a circus. It was such a clown car show.
Totally a circus.
Right. I mean, it was clowns jumping out of a car.
I still don't think that Trump would have done as well if they had just had less candidates.
Well, be that as it may,
But-
what was a shock to me, and I think a lot of other people, was how poorly Jeb Bush did. I think that, as much as anything else, is a signal of how how much disgust Americans feel for
With establishment and
politicians. Right.
Mhm.
So, people make fun of me sometimes for my disgust for people just because of their political legacy, but I think clearly, as far as Jeb Bush is concerned, Americans share it because
Don't you like his logo, Jeb?
Jeb,
He didn't even put Bush in there because he knew.
he knew he couldn't put his last name in there, right? People are tired of voting for Bushes. People hate Bushes. But like the lady said, your brother created ISIS. His brother created
Yes.
ISIS.
How do you
So,
feel about that, Jeb?
well, I mean, he's sure all sorts of excuses. But the media horse race and how there's no accountability for being wrong. There's not even really a mea culpa, although I'll give the political establishment some credit at that. It's like I said, first you abandon principle, then you abandon dignity, and last you abandon pretense. And the political establishment, many of them still retain shreds of their principle and much of their pretense, even though they've all abandoned their dignity long ago. And the
So what's going to happen when Bernie wins California? What do you think?
I think nothing will change. I think that it's already priced into the market, to use a financial services term. Bernie will have a certain number of delegates, and the superdelegates will just strangle them under the rug. I think he has this. He has this final pitch that his team has been working on, is that he's going to come up a little bit short on pledged delegates, but clearly Hillary's not going to clinch the nomination with just pledged delegates, right? They're both going to have enough pledged delegates so that superdelegates, one way or the other, are going to pick
Are
the
going
candidate.
to yes.
Right, and
I mean, the truth is, of all the superdelegates, right, that have the opportunity to vote for who they want,
well, the interesting
could
thing,
vote for Bernie. I believe Bernie could win. I don't know
interesting
all the
thing,
numbers,
yeah, and
but
that's the funny thing is the interesting thing is the original purpose of superdelegates, the official position of the Democratic Party when they created superdelegates, the canonical reason, as it were, for having them is that superdelegates prevent an unpopular nominee who manages to win the majority of pledged delegates from forcing the party to lose the nomination, right? And it was sort of a response to Carter, where establishment insiders didn't want Carter run for re-election because they felt he was particularly weak in the election in 1980, but
no, he
that-
was, but
he was. I think he still would have won if
Carter.
he'd have got the damn hostages out. I mean, he says that himself. But the issue being that going forward, they wanted to have this buffer where if the popular vote was close enough, if somebody didn't get enough pledged delegates to clinch it, then the superdelegates can pick the candidate that was more likely to succeed. That's the official reason why these anti-democratic superdelegates exist, right?
so if you use that same reason,
If you use that same reason-
might say Bernie is the better.
You'd be a
nominee.
fool not to say that.
Yes.
If that was the true purpose of superdelegates, they should all be voting for Bernie, because it's very clear to even the most casual political observer that this is the year of the anti-establishment candidate, right? It's very clear to even the most casual poll watcher that Bernie polls better against Trump,
Yes.
and always has, even when most of the country didn't know him. He's always polled better against Trump than Hillary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not just talking about right now a single spot poll, right? I'm talking about every poll going back to the beginning of the election.
Well, that's the thing is I still have some shred of hope for Bernie, and I don't think that anyone really knows. But I mean, if you're,
In keeping with the spirit of the podcast, I think you should abandon all hope. Right?
I should abandon all hope. Well, probably what's going to happen is Hillary's going to get the nomination, and Bernie is continuing to run, and we're hoping that he shifts Hillary to the left, but we all have the same concern that she's just going to go right back to the middle after she gets the nomination, which is a slight fear of mine as well. But on the good side, because I am optimistic, unlike you, I think that this whole Bernie movement has gotten people energized, and hopefully on the state level, in the Congress, the Senate, we will start to make more progressive change. That people are more engaged, and that's the only way things are going to change. You might disagree with that, but if you work within the system, you need to vote and you need to change.
Yes. I think that is kind of a fundamental issue that we circle around a lot on this podcast is it worth bothering with working in the system, or should we just abandon the system because it's so hopelessly decrepit and anti-democratic? I think that's the bottom line, is that it's anti-democratic. But
I agree that it should be more democratic. People should be making more decisions on their own rather than having representatives.
yes,
I mean,
think
that's a definite.
if we're doing utopian dreaming, if it's going to be that kind of a podcast, we should talk about that and how. Because one criticism people always say to you to just shut you down and not allow you to speak is, well, what would you do, right? And then if you don't immediately have a fully fleshed out 15-point process, then they dismiss you. They say you don't have a plan, so we can't change anything.
Because it's so
and if
easy
you do have a
to
15-point plan,
knock things down. And
if you do have a 15-point plan, they find some other way to kill you. You know, they say you're too wonkish. You know, you're too much of a dreamer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a basic rhetorical strategy that every lawyer knows, right? And the way you win most of these little rhetorical battles is you just don't play them, right? You don't try to. It's like Sun Tzu in The Art of War. Like, you fight on ground of your choosing, not of the enemy's choosing, right? Because that's what determines who wins the battle more than anything else, is the context in which.
So what are you saying? You don't knock people down? I'm saying that when you knock people down, somebody will say, well, you don't have a 15-point plan, and then you say you have a 15-point plan, then you're being too wonkish. So what is the other?
What's the third way?
Yeah.
Sometimes the third way is to counterattack. You know, sometimes the third way is to say, you don't have a plan either, right? Sometimes the way is to distract. You know,
It's another way of attacking. That's
right. I
what
mean,
think.
in general, and Sun Tzu talks about this as well. It's interesting because you've never read Sun Tzu, and yet you're majored in philosophy. So why is that? How did you miss out on one of the great? I mean, this is seriously. How did you miss out on one of the great historical philosophers, right?
Well, I did take.
Because he didn't label himself as a philosopher.
Possibly.
So
It's more almost like political science in a way.
but relating back to what we were talking about earlier, so we can close the loop on that conversation. I think that by trying to make a pitch for the superdelegates, Bernie is fighting on ground of his opponent's choosing, and thus will lose. Right? Clinton has already been ceding that ground for a long enough time. Enough of those people owe her family directly or indirectly. She's got enough influence over all of them. And like we've talked about earlier, they resent Bernie because he hasn't paid his dues. It's nothing to do with anything else, right?
But you're right about seating all these people, because all the people, superdelegates in Rhode Island, are all for Clinton. There's nobody even toying with the idea for Bernie.
And here's
she's got them in her pocket, and I'm sure it's that way throughout the nation.
And here's an interesting thing about that too that just occurred to me, is while we're on the subject of political philosophy, or martial philosophy of how power is brokered, a lot of the Bernie folks, the people that come from the Bernie establishment, let's not forget that the Bernie team, we asked them for their lists to call for our Democratic slate of candidates, for our progressive Dems, and they're not providing the lists to us. And that is, I think, a mistake, not only from an ideological perspective, but that's simply not the way that you gain power. Is you share power, right? So Clinton has been willing to do these things, to share her power with other people, and that's how she's gained influence, right? And the Bernie people are thinking, well, if we can't have total control of how the list is being used, we're not going to release it. But that's not how you build a power base, right?
I agree.
Ironically,
I agree. I mean, I think everyone has this weird fear that, maybe us progressives are getting on the bandwagon of the Bernie movement. But I know, honestly, that I want progressive change. I wanted it before Bernie was on the scene. Well, I mean, he's been on the scene for a long time, but before he ran for president. And Well, I think it's because they don't know us as well. Like the Bernie people.
Right, but
they
that's
seem to come out of, many of them were not part of politics. They became part of politics and they became friends among themselves, and as a progressive Democrat, we're more involved in the rest of the
Right.
political.
And that's exactly
things
what I'm
that go
saying. That's
on.
exactly what the problem is. Like in a lot of things, when you approach from an attitude of scarcity, when you're like, I have only a little bit of power, right? So I have to be real careful about who I share it with and what I use
Right.
it for, right? And you look at the Clinton camp, where Clinton's team, they will share power with anyone who kisses the rings. It doesn't matter who they are, right?
Well, that's the problem.
Mass murderer, strong progressive, doesn't matter. As long as they swear fealty, that's it, right? As long as they're willing to say, and they'll share what power they have with them, and that's how you grow a power base, right? And the Bernie people, they've had the attitude of, we've got this list, we've worked hard to get this
Because they
list.
have worked really hard. But
Right. But we've worked hard to get this list. Somebody else hasn't paid their dues. We're not going to share the list with them.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the mentality that's opposing them in the first place. So it's interesting how robust the problem is. Whereas even the Bernie team, they want to be transformational, but their understanding of how power works is.
Well, Grant, the
somewhat
only thing
flawed.
I can do really is,
Well, the
do what
only
I
thing-
can.
the only thing that you
And
can
I'm
do is what
trying
you're
to do.
doing.
Yeah, that's
Right.
what I'm
We can
trying to.
all of us have our roles to play, right? And this is my role, I suppose, is to educate 5 people slowly about things they'd prefer not to know about through my podcast. So, moving on, I think we've talked a lot about the Democratic presidential primary. Others, I think you should abandon hope. I think we're going to have a general election where it's clearly the most likely scenario is Clinton versus Trump. I think it's much more likely that Trump will emerge victorious than Clinton.
That's crazy, but okay. What the hell?
It's crazy, but
That's crazy.
I think
I don't even want to think of a world like that, but
Well, I want to enhance your willingness to think of horrible things. That's the point of the
that's
podcast,
okay.
right? Because you should think about the horror that is that. And I think it's interesting too because people have talked a lot about how Trump is a fascist, and I agree with the growing body of thinkers who are saying he's not a fascist, he's a right-wing populist, and they've had these in Europe for some time, and
It's true.
and
It's true.
we've in a way, I don't want to say we've been lucky, right? But we were certainly due for this sort of a
See, I think that you think
culmination.
if Trump becomes president, it will maybe create a larger backlash that will move the country in possibly a better direction. But I think that it would harm the country. It would harm the country even more so by allowing Trump to actually become president. And I don't think that there would be such a backlash. I think it would just move the dial over to a bad place.
Here's what and here's my response to that. So, I think that the difference between Trump and Clinton is largely window dressing and a few details, right? Right now, Trump says he's pro-life. Tomorrow might be pro-choice. He was
Well,
pro-choice yesterday,
I
right?
yes. I
Clinton-
think that that's very true, but you know what? I think that has a lot to do with, I think Trump doesn't care. I'm starting to understand Trump, like why he can say he's for something and then against something, because the truth is he doesn't really care. So what he's going to do to the Republicans, I'm sure, all the things that he cares about, which are very few, he's going to do. And then I'm sure he's saying behind the doors to these Paul Ryan and stuff, what do you want me to say about abortion? Oh, okay. I need to be pro-life. Okay, I'll guarantee. And
Right.
so all the other agenda, he's
And
going to
like
go
we've-
with the Republicans, and it's going to be bad.
And like we've talked about before on the podcast, though, so the Clintons appointed Trump's sister to a federal judgeship,
Yes.
right? And of course that screwed up right there. Somebody who inherits $200 million from their daddy should never be a federal judge. That should be a disqualifier, But
But you're saying
I'm not exaggerating. You
Well,
shouldn't
you're
give people with that much wealth that much power.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's bad enough they can already buy assassins to kill you and buy lawyers and judges to get them off. What, they can actually buy judgeships? Become judges, right? So there's no reason to
say
think
that Clinton is similar to Trump. There is something to say about Trump coming out and being racist, saying all these unbelievable things that Clinton doesn't. Maybe Clinton does it, I don't know, behind the doors or does it in other ways. It's still worse
What
when
you're
you
saying
come out
is-
and say.
What you're saying is it's worse, but that's the thing that I disagree on. So if Clinton, let's just say hypothetical crazy example. Let's say that Trump and Clinton both want to execute all illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, I should say.
Okay.
They both want to do that, and they'll both foster the same policy, right? But Clinton is smart enough to cloak her statements in obscurity, right? I mean, you had me read for your book club, your progressive book club, The New Jim Crow. And The New Jim Crow essentially lays the blame for the prison-industrial complex at the feet of Bill Clinton.
Yes.
Because no Republican could have been able to do that.
So I'm saying I agree that both the strategies, doing something underhanded without directly saying what you're doing versus Trump, who's directly saying I'm going to do this and does it. Why it makes it worse isn't the policies themselves, but it is the view, the culture, the culture of the nation to think that it's okay to be racist. It is not okay.
Right, and that's exactly...
It's separate from the policies. I believe, I agree with the policies are bad. I don't want to see those policies, but there's another step that Trump gives us, which is this, Trump says this is okay, so then it becomes okay in culture, and that is a scary
You're saying
proposition.
I guess maybe you're right, because I am thinking that will provoke a backlash, because I could give you example after example after example on race, because it's been kind of a focus of our reading in the book club, and it's been a personal topic of mine. But I'm sure there are also issues of sexism. There are also other issues that arise where we could talk about. Information could be found. But race is the easiest.
Well, the demographics are changing, so there possibly could really be a backlash.
And that would be... That's the thing, is that right now, the way I see it is I'm being given the opportunity to choose who will be the leader of my enemy's forces. And I want the one who I think is weaker, who I think is more beatable, whose flaws are more crippling, right? And of the two, I think even you would not disagree with me that Trump is more deeply flawed than Clinton. He's more visibly flawed.
Yes.
It's easier to exploit an egomaniac narcissist than it is.
do you really want this man to have nuclear?
Nuclear, you mean?
Nuclear. Thank
Nuclear.
you. Nuclear.
There is no word nuclear.
I know.
Nuclear. Nuclear is a
sound
W
like
word.
Bush now.
You
yeah.
do. You sound like
That's
Bush.
awful.
Yeah.
Do you want him to have the codes? Isn't
What
that
you're saying is,
is that scary? That is so scary.
People
to
talk
me.
about the bomb a lot.
This guy is crazy. Trump is crazy.
When at the end of World War II, and this is a particularly famous episode, the Allies firebombed Dresden, right? They killed 60,000 people. They killed more people than died, at least at first, in Hiroshima. And and Dresden was completely obliterated by fire, right? I mean, every place just completely incinerated. And this is made famous, of course, because a famous white American author chose to write about it, Kurt Vonnegut, in the book Slaughterhouse-Five, which I think was made into a movie. But you're saying nuclear weapons are fundamentally terrifying, and that the idea that Trump would use them should scare me into voting for Clinton. And I could make and do make the broader point that I refuse to allow my vote to be dictated by fear, right? And I think that's a very important point. But we'll set that aside for the moment because that's not going to sway somebody who's listening to this podcast who feels that fear. You know, I know from experience that if you're afraid, somebody else telling you don't be afraid doesn't help.
So we'll see.
So let's
if
let's
Trump,
set aside fear.
I am open to the possibility that Trump could win. I'm not saying, oh, he can't possibly win, because the truth is this election season,
Right.
Nobody knows anything.
But we're talking about nuclear
But I
weapons.
hope-
So let's talk about nuclear
Oh.
weapons. You brought up the subject of
Okay.
nuclear weapons because you said you don't want to have Trump to have his finger on the bomb. And I'm trying to say that even in that example, I just don't think there's that much meaningful difference. You know, in terms of radiological poisoning, right?
Well,
so we already fire
Yeah.
radioactive waste at our enemies. We call it depleted uranium rounds because it sounds cool, right? But we don't have a problem using radiological weapons, right, on our enemies. Nobody's
Okay,
talking
well-
about containing that. You don't think that if Clinton becomes president, that we'll have wars that serve power rather than democracy?
Actually, I think what scares me a little bit more about Trump is that he doesn't have any sort of respect for history, political foreign policy. You can tell by what he says. And the fact that he has no respect for it, the possibility of him doing anything without context of all the other countries and things that have happened in history that's frightening. That's frightening.
And here's my response. Hillary takes her marching orders on foreign policy from Henry Kissinger. She said it herself, and we've got plenty of examples to prove it. Henry Kissinger is a war criminal. There's tens of thousands of, not just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have died because of Henry Kissinger.
I guess it's like the devil you know and the devil you don't.
Right.
Like, we know what she will do. I don't know what Trump will do. And anyone who thinks they know what Trump would do is like, I don't believe
Yeah, and
them.
you're saying that the uncertain is more scary than the certain. I'll agree with you on that. I'm just saying that I refuse to accept the certain, right? Clinton will get a lot of Americans killed in unnecessary wars. That's what she's always done. That's what Kissinger would have her do, right? That's the foreign policy that she's steeped in. All the foreign policy she talks about, it's all hawk. Her answer to everything is kill them, right? So you're saying, oh, Trump is going to be crazy. Well, yes, Trump will be crazy, but so will Clinton. Clinton will just be crazy in a way that is more insidious, right? Americans don't learn about, we learn about foreign policy debacles when they're profoundly stupid, right? But when people die because of foreign policy missteps and they're done covertly or they're done in places that aren't in the public eye, we don't care as much. You know, if I hadn't read the Shock Doctrine, for example, I never would have known about the millions of people we got killed in South America through our evil policies there, right? But
Chile.
everybody knows about Iraq.
Pinochet.
Why do we know about Iraq? Because George Bush and his cronies were profoundly stupid people, right?
Wow. I don't know if you want to wrap it up, but...
Well, I don't think we should wrap it up just yet. I mean, I can tell the question you ask implies that you're tired of talking to me, which who could blame you? But before I let you go, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about philosophy because I think really there's a lot of grim insights that people have come up with through the ages that don't get publicized. You know, I mean, hell, you go back to the oldest philosophers, people like Socrates or Socrates or however you want to pronounce his name.
Socrates. Yeah.
Socrates, right? If you believe Socrates was even real and not an invention of Plato, but Socrates, he pissed a lot of people off because he was always asking uncomfortable questions.
True.
In fact, that was, in a nutshell, that's all Socrates ever did to the
Was
point
ask
where
questions.
was
Yeah.
ask questions that made people uncomfortable, right? And
Or made them think.
well, thinking is uncomfortable.
Well, no.
I think contemplating certain deep truths about existence is uncomfortable. And I think that was probably what Socrates, more than anything, wanted people to do. He wanted them to question, what does it mean to be human? What is the purpose of law?
Life.
Right.
What's the purpose of life?
What is the purpose of life? And in the end, he essentially kills himself, right?
Yes.
He doesn't.
Well,
To say he kills himself is an oversimplification, right? To those of you who don't know the story, Socrates, after a lifetime of asking people uncomfortable questions, right, had. Well, this might even be a myth. This might not even be true. Although we tend to think that it is. Most historians believe that there was a person named Socrates who did exist, right? In the same way that most historians believe there was a person named Jesus Christ that did exist. But we only know about Jesus Christ because people have written about him. And we only know about Socrates because Plato and Aristotle wrote about him, right? So, theoretically, he was just a device that they used to advance an aspect of their personal philosophies. But if you believe in the legend of Socrates,
yes.
So Socrates, after a lifetime of asking people really uncomfortable questions,
Yes.
Was accused of corrupting the youth. Essentially, simply by asking questions. Socrates never provided people with answers.
That's
he
right.
didn't do that ever. He never said to people, you should think this, right?
No.
He always said, what about this?
So where are you going with this?
After a lifetime of just asking questions, he was accused and convicted of corrupting the youth,
Yes.
right?
Then he ate
And he was
hemlock
well.
juice,
He was sentenced to die
right?
by the authorities of Athens, but they didn't really want him to die. They didn't want the spectacle of him dying on their hands. They just wanted him gone, right? And so, with official sanction, his friends went to go get him out of prison, and they said, live out your days in exile. We'll pay for you. We'll take care of you. You'll get to keep living. His students all pressed upon him to do that, but he refused. And he said something about the law and about how his respect for the law was so great that he wouldn't break the law. But I don't think anyone believes that. A man who spent his entire life asking questions about the law, asking people to consider whether laws were just, then just says, no, I'm going to die because the law says it. No, I think he decided that he wanted to die because he was tired of living, or he wanted to die to prove a point, right? He wanted to show,
what point was that?
to demonstrate the injustice of a system that killed him for asking questions.
Does it demonstrate that?
I don't know. What do you think, philosopher?
Well, the fact that many people don't know that story it shows that it didn't really have. I don't know. Maybe it had an effect on Plato and Aristotle, and I don't know. I mean,
You say that, but obviously the teachings of Jesus Christ are quite different. But in the end, the way they die is remarkably similar. Because Jesus' buddies offered to cut him down and save him, and he said no. Right? Would there be a Jesus without a Socrates? Is it really that different?
Death? Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's true. I mean, so what's the point? Where are you going with that? I don't know where you're going with it.
What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to tell us a little bit. You've worn a lot of hats in your life, and you've really had an interesting life. I mean, we could do a podcast if this were that kind of a podcast. We could do a podcast about all the radically different jobs and careers that you've had in your lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of fascinating how many different things that you've done, and how it seems like every so often I'll talk to you and you'll say, oh yeah, I did that. And I'll be like, What? Yeah, I mean, I used to work in Silicon Valley. Wait, what? So in your experience, you've had so far, it seems, a rich and full life, and you've studied philosophy as a subject,
Yes.
not as a dilettante or a layperson, but as the core of your education, right?
Okay.
So surely you
well,
must have learned something that you can
From
transmit
philosophy?
to it. Yes.
Well, I have to say that I always was a person that asked why about everything before I even went into philosophy. And for me, philosophy was a natural fit because it's what I did anyway. So it wasn't like philosophy taught me to ask those questions why. Like, why do we live? I think I was searching for those answers. If anything, philosophy gave me all different knowledge about how other people answered that question. What is the meaning of life, or what our purpose is, from Plato to Hume to Kant to, Sartre and Nietzsche and everybody,
Right.
right? And all men, right? I don't think there was one woman. Ayn Rand sometimes is considered a philosopher, but we didn't really.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Sun Tzu is much more of a philosopher than Ayn Rand is a philosopher.
Yes.
Ayn Rand is an ideologue,
Yes. But okay. So what
Wasn't
did I
ideologue.
learn from it? This is what I learned. I learned that from taking years of philosophy, and I took some graduate classes in philosophy as well, that you can argue anything. You can literally argue anything, and it's really up to you to figure out what the purpose of life is for you. But once you make that argument, everything has to fit into that.
Right. So everything needs to fit into this idea that, whatever your meaning of life is, everything needs to be tied to that. But we see people not living like that all the time. We have this problem of cognitive dissonance, where people, they have their philosophy of life.
They
but
don't
live it.
connect those things.
Right.
They have narratives for different issues, and then they don't connect them together.
Right. And I think that the main reason people talk about cognitive dissonance like it's a problem of the brain, but one way to describe it is really when the meaning of life that you've been assigned is at odds with the way you want to live your life or the way you want to view yourself, right?
Yes.
Like if you want to view yourself as an independent thinker, but you're merely parroting things that you've heard other people say, then
you're not an independent thinker.
You're not an independent thinker by definition.
Right.
And I think that we have all the time, when you're young, you get a meaning of life assigned to you. I think everybody at some point when they're young, some authority figure will try to put into your head a concept for the meaning of your life before you have any of the adult cynicism to defend yourself or any other defense mechanism against that authority figure. And so I think part of the human experience is that everybody, maybe somebody somewhere, but everybody almost without exception, if there are any exceptions, I've never met one, part of becoming an adult is trying to figure out who you are as opposed to who you've been told that you have to be. And so we're really not that different from guys like Junior, to bring it back home to the podcast, where his whole life he's been told who he is. Well, he's Junior, right? He's going to have a law practice. He's going to be a politician. He's going to do all these cool things. He's going to live where he needs to live to get the job right. I mean,
right.
He's going to care about animals and other stuff that doesn't matter. He's going to cut budgets to organizations and then feed the money back through legislative grants. But all of that just stems from being told who he is and being comfortable with that definition, right? Not having to question it.
Yeah, well, I think you're right in that. I think what causes people to question their narratives is probably things not working out, emotional pain, or things like that. But I don't know if it goes back to Trump. Maybe if things get really bad, everyone will be questioning themselves in life and the government. And
well, that's how
that's how you're getting to that.
That's where I'm leading it on. I think that's a great place to leave the podcast. Is that I'm thinking maybe it might be more hopeful. There might be more hope for the future if Trump is the president than Clinton. As sad as that is to say, because if your mind is liberated, if the only way we can think of to make you question the meaning of life is to experience discomfort, Well, I think we can both agree that we're all going to experience a lot more discomfort.
So
Under
your
Trump than
your
Clinton.
suicide attempt is voting for Trump. It's like
Yes, that's my homage to Socrates, who died for me thousands of years ago. Is I'm going to vote for Trump. All right, well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast again, Jennifer. Good luck with your campaign. We'll post a link where people should give you all of their money so that you can feed your campaign account. And I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for listening, all 5 of you, to another episode of the Grim Wisdom Podcast. And we'll be back with you, if not next week, if not before. Take care.